Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another United States Studies Center webinar. This one, an extraordinary day for the United States Study Center. Over 600 of you have registered for this event across the world. Thank you for your interest in today's topic, and in advance, thank you to this amazing panel, this distinguished panel that has joined us today. My name is Simon Jackman. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Sydney and the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney. And we begin our events by acknowledging that the University of Sydney, where the United States Study Center stands, itself stands on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I've been the CEO of the United States Study Center now for 4 years. The mission of the center is to educate Australians about the United States and about Australia's relationship with the United States. And when I took on the role, coming back from a long career in the United States, one of the first things I discovered was that everybody in Australia can tell you that China is Australia's largest trading partner. But very few people could then answer the question, who is our largest investment partner? And the answer to that question, of course, is the United States. And that was something that I was determined to set about making sure the United States Study Center took a keen interest in that vital aspect of the relationship. So often, the US-Australia relationship is framed through the capital A alliance. And as important and as vital, as essential as that is, it often leads us to overlook the fact that the lifeblood of the US-Australia relationship is the day-to-day, person-to-person contacts and the business-to-business contacts. And when you understand the immensity of the investment relationship between Australia and the United States, now valued cumulatively at about a year's worth of Australian GDP, or about the market cap of the Australian Stock Exchange, 1.8 trillion Australian dollars cumulatively. Once you understand that number, it puts the US-Australia relationship in an importantly different context of the way it's often framed in popular debate in Australia, and popular debate that often leads to a sort of an oversimplification of Australia's strategic circumstances. Trade and prosperity equals China, security equals the United States. Life is not that simple. And indeed, 2 reports now the United States Study Center has produced in the last couple of years, but critically, one that came out last week, served to underscore that point, the value and depth of the two-way investment relationship between the two countries, the different forms it takes. And of course, that glaring fact about Australian public opinion that I just alluded to, the fact that very few people, struggles to break 20% of the Australian population, can accurately identify the United States as our largest investment partner. So today, on the back of us releasing that report last week, that's on the United States Study Center website, we are also marking the fact that it is 15 years since the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement was brought into operation. And so we've decided to do 2 things on this extraordinary webinar today: to take a retrospective look on how it was that remarkable achievement that set in place so much of the architecture and set in place so much of the vibrant trajectory that the US-Australia investment relationship has been on. How was it that agreement came to be struck? What were the issues at the time? But we also want to very quickly then pivot to the current state of play and some of the issues in front of the United States and Australia in their trade investment relationship, but again, set against the obvious context, and that is US-China, the most important bilateral relationship in the world right now, with immense implications, as we all understand, for Australia, implicating almost everything, not just our security relationship with the United States, but changing almost in real time the nature of our investment relationship, as the world of economics and the world of national security are probably closer now than they've ever been, certainly in my adult lifetime, and we'll hear more about that perhaps in the second half of today's conversation, some of the issues confronting the international trade environment. And now, look, it's a great pleasure to tell you about our panel today, real briefly. We have former Prime Minister John Howard, one of the founders, frankly, of the United States Study Center. It was during his prime ministership that the United States Study Center was founded. And of course, anybody with a familiarity of Mr. Howard's term in office will also recall that he's a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, an extremely rare honor for non-citizens of the United States to have that honor. And of course, he was Prime Minister at the time that the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement was negotiated and completed. Also joining us, Australia's current ambassador to the United States, Arthur Sinodinos. We're also joined by former Ambassador Joe Hockey, who will be moderating most of the event today. We're also joined by Australia's ambassador to the United States at the time of the negotiation of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. That's Michael Thorley. We're also joined by former US Trade Representatives Bob Zelig, who was in that role at the time of the negotiation of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And we're also joined by Wendy Cutler. Wendy Cutler also served the USTR, but was in that role at a period when the TPP was the big agenda item in the bilateral trade and indeed the multilateral trade relationships of the United States at that time. And look, we're also joined in a little moment by a video greeting from the Prime Minister. And I do want to single out at the top of this call the hard yards done by the chairman of the board of the United States Study Center, Mr. Mark Bailey, who did so much of the legwork in pulling together this amazing panel, the most distinguished panel by a long shot that I've had the pleasure of hosting here in about the 32 or so webinars the United States Study Center has held in this COVID era. So look, that's more than enough from me at the top of this event. It's a remarkable event. Thank you for joining us. Ambassador Sinodinos, can I hand over to you at this juncture? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Simon. And thank you to you and to Mark for pulling the event together today. The US Study Center, I think, goes from strength to strength. And as we were discussing before we came on, there couldn't be a better time to have a US Study Center, given what is happening in this amazing country right now, in this incredible election year where we've had COVID-19, we've had an economic contraction, we've had racial protests. This place has had everything. And in that sense, it's been a very stimulating time to be here. But what I found from when I got here in February is the incredible goodwill there is towards Australia. And that has several pillars. One of them, of course, is the long-standing defence relationship and the other elements of security relations that flow from that. The fact that we've been together as allies, or fighting together through all of the major conflicts of the 20th century, and fighting in a sense for what I like to describe as decent, humane, universal values. And that's important. And of course, our mateship campaign, which my predecessor, Joe, was so instrumental in launching here in the US, really touched a bone because it went to the nature of that relationship. But the relationship is broader than that. And today is about the many ways in which the economic and trade relationship has developed. And, you know, there was talk about a free trade agreement of some type, even back as far as 1945. It came up in the 80s and the 90s. But when George W. Bush in 2001 decided, and this is before 9/11 or anything else, to raise the issue again, because he found a very trusted partner in John Howard, that's when things really started to get rolling. And that economic and trade relationship has provided the context in which I can confidently go into any boardroom or any company here in the US and talk about the extent of the links between the two countries. You mentioned the trade links, you mentioned the investment links, how big they are. I think of companies like BlueScope here in the US. I think of companies like Visy Industries and the great work that Anthony Pratt and his people are doing. And then others who've come over here in the technology sector, like Atlassian or Afterpay, and how well they've done. And it's a reminder that we are treated very well in this country when it comes to economic and trade relationships. But of course, what the FTA has done is give us the opportunity and the access. We've then had to earn it by being competitive, globally oriented, and all the rest. That's not to take away from the need for us to be match fit, because this market is a very competitive market. The margins aren't always great because of that competitiveness, but if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. And I say to people, given the diversity of these markets, the population, the income levels, this is a great opportunity for Australian companies that want to be going global or want to be born global. And what the free trade agreement has done is give us an underpinning, a certainty to the relationship. It's given us access that was otherwise going to be crimped in various ways. It's helped to protect some of our access as well as expanding some of our other access. I think of areas like beef, the way we've educated people about the lamb market here and grown the lamb market. The fact of the matter is that since the FTA was enacted, I can't think of us having a major trade dispute with the US. Whereas I can remember, and John Howard will remember, how when we got to Washington in, I think it was 1997, to be shirt-fronted by the Clinton administration over lamb tariffs. This was a measure, to be fair to the administration, I think this was more an act of the Congress, but the fact of the matter was we were faced with this, and the Prime Minister had to do a bit of quick footwork with President Clinton in a one-on-one at the White House before our general meeting to sort all of that out. But my point is that since we put the framework of the free trade agreement together, it's provided a certainty and underpinning to the relationship. That investment is now ongoing. So when these 15 years, when we look back on the achievements, Simon's point that we need to look to the future, how do we build on the relationship? We don't take it for granted. I personally believe there's a lot of potential in the relationship on the economic side. I'm particularly interested in the area of science, technology, and innovation. I don't buy this thesis of inevitable American decline. We certainly have a rising great power in China, but when you look at the inventiveness, the capacity for innovation, the willingness of this country to reinvent itself over time, and it will again. It faced up to the threats of World War II and invented, or was largely responsible for the Bretton Woods arrangements, which gave us the peace and prosperity of the last 70 years. It faced up to the challenge of a rising Japan, and people then were saying the Americans can't beat the industrial policy of the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry. So there have been these challenges through time, but Americans have responded by reinventing themselves. So for us, betting on America and being part of that journey is important, and what we can learn, particularly around innovation, how we apply it to our ecosystem or back home, is one of the things I really want to pursue in my time in the job here. Now, I have the pleasure now of introducing a video from our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who had a very successful visit here last year, a state visit, which my predecessor, Joe, was instrumental in, and which has taken on legend here in Washington, I think, about what a great event it was. But coming out of that was a terrific work program as well around how we work together on space, critical minerals, frontier technologies. So there are all these areas where we're working up and developing the future. So without further ado, we're now going to switch to a video from our Prime Minister to welcome us all here today. Thank you.
I don't know if you've ever been to Wapakoneta. It's in Ohio, a town of some 10,000 people. It's the birthplace of Neil Armstrong. Now, I was there last September opening the new Pratt recycling and paper plant with President Trump. It's a fantastic facility. What I saw in Wapakoneta was Australian investment and American jobs building prosperity for both. Today you are celebrating 15 years of the free trade agreement between the United States and Australia. Australia and the US understand that liberty and enterprise go hand in hand. No nation grows rich by selling things to itself. Today, I pay tribute to the work of my predecessor, John Howard, who worked to make the free trade agreement a reality. And I'm so glad that he is part of this important event. As President George W. Bush, when he and John Howard met at the White House in 2005, said this: "Trade will help our economies stay strong, and free trade and fair trade is important for working people in both our countries." It's true then, true now. The results speak for themselves. Over the last 15 years, goods and services trade between our two countries has almost doubled. Total investment almost tripled. Our exports to the United States include everything from beef to aircraft and parts to pharmaceuticals. And our imports range from vehicles, medical instruments, telecommunications equipment. The US has helped power the modern Australian economy. The US is our largest foreign investor and has enabled Australian companies to access the capital and technology they need to grow. We've returned the favour, with the US being the biggest destination for Australia investment dollars, including in Wapakoneta. I saw that firsthand. Our ties, of course, run deeper than economics. There are just so many other layers, whether we're talking about our cultural relationship, our scientific relationship, our defence partnership, our security relationship. The US-Australia relationship has never been stronger, and it's never been more important. We are a trusted partner of the United States. We trust each other. And as I said to President Trump last year when we met, Australia looks to the US, sure, but we don't leave it to the US. We do our share of heavy lifting in this partnership. We lead, we pull our weight. I wish everyone taking part in today's event a great day of discussion and insights, and I really want to thank the US Study Centre for your efforts in upholding this great friendship between Australia and the United States. I wish you all the best.
Terrific. Thank you, Arthur, and our thanks, of course, to the Prime Minister. And I should also add that at roughly half time in today's event, we also are honoured to have a message of support and some reflections from the Ambassador of the United States to Australia, A.B. Culverhouse. We're looking forward to that a little later in the event. And it was terrific to have Arthur kick us off, because I did single out John Howard as one of the founders of the US Study Centre, but of course, Ambassador Sinodinos, or Arthur as he's known to many of us, was Mr. Howard's Chief of Staff at the time of the founding of the United States Study Centre, and along with the American Australia Association, so critical to the founding and indeed the sustenance of the United States Study Centre over its history. And indeed, that takes me to Joe Hockey, who in his term as ambassador recently concluded was just not only a great asset for Australia, by the way, most importantly, but a great asset for the United States Study Centre. When we were in town, and the full weight of his office and the embassy help the United States Study Centre with its networks and the business we need to transact with government, and access to people in government, and access to people in our embassy who are themselves transacting the US-Australia relationship. We couldn't have had the success we've had over the last couple of years without Joe being such a formidable presence in Washington. And to that end, I'm also pleased to announce today that Joe is joining the United States Study Centre as a distinguished ambassadorial fellow. And that's an appointment. Yes, that awaits you, Arthur. But no, we are absolutely thrilled. We want to make more use of the tremendous networks that Joe built up during his time as ambassador, and drawing on his wisdom between now and the election in particular and beyond. And so I'm delighted to announce that. And I can't think of a better way to hand over the event now to Joe. Over to you, Joe. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Simon, and hello, everyone. And we're going to be a little pithier from now on, because we need to get through this and give everyone a chance to have a say. We begin with Australia's greatest Prime Minister, and certainly someone I was proud to serve with in government, Prime Minister John Howard. I still feel the need to call him Prime Minister, and it's a great American tradition, and he's the only Prime Minister we have live. Prime Minister, you were the initiator of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. You described it in the 10th anniversary. You said you had real satisfaction around the agreement. Can you just give us a little sense of the history of the agreement as you see it? And importantly, what prompted you to utilise what was arguably the closest relationship between an Australian Prime Minister and a United States President? What prompted you to use that relationship as a tool to deliver a free trade agreement between two developed countries?
Before I answer that, can I just congratulate the Study Centre, Mark Bailey and Simon Jackman, on their initiative in organising this. And can I single out two people on the panel, Bob Zellick and Michael Thorley, for the tremendous work they did at the coalface to get this trade agreement on foot. Without them, and they were working day and night together, it wouldn't have come about. I think it's very important. I'm sure at a head of government level, George Bush was very committed to it. I was very committed to it. Now, the history of it is, as Arthur said, 1945, some people were talking about it. It's one of those things that have been thrown around, but what I think should be remembered, and the Americans on the panel can correct me if I'm wrong, it was unusual to have a free trade agreement like this between two very developed countries. Sure, you had NAFTA, which involved Canada and Mexico, that had a special regional geographic significance. And therefore, there was something of an exception to a rule. And that was a token of the very close and intimate relationship between our two countries. Now, why did I take advantage? It would seem the most natural thing in the world, given the closeness of our relationship, to promote it with George Bush. Didn't need a lot of promoting. He was keen to help because he responded very warmly to the support that Australia gave to America in all sorts of ways. And a lot of people imagine that that Americans don't take, tend to take some of their friends for granted. Well, my experience is that America has never taken Australia for granted. America has always appreciated the support our country's given to the United States in times of difficulty. I think it's fair to say that the idea of having a free trade agreement was around before George Bush was elected president, but it was supercharged. The drive for it was supercharged after he became president. That is incidentally not to denigrate the willingness of the Clinton administration to work through trade difficulties. I mean, I remember our celebrated encounter on Australian lamb, but I found Bill Clinton a good problem solver when it came to the relationship between our two countries. So I remember the days, the early months of the Bush presidency, and we talked about it, and there was a growing commitment to it. And I can remember that I thought I finally got there a weekend that Jeanette and I spent on the President's Ranch in Texas, and we had a long discussion about a variety of things, including this. And I felt that particular discussion put beyond doubt the commitment that he had to this free trade agreement. So I think I'll finish by saying that it was a special demonstration of a particularly intimate relationship that the United States, the most developed country in the world, should see fit to negotiate a free trade agreement with another developed country. It was a natural expression of that very, very intimate relationship. And I look back over the last 15 years and think how the trade scene around the world has ebbed and flowed and changed. And it's been quite volatile. And I say, thank heaven we have got the free trade agreement, because not only has it reinforced the bilateral relationship between Australia and the United States. And above and beyond that, it's provided anchorage in a very, very difficult and challenging trading environment. And the reinforcement of American investment in Australia, the constant examples of business figures from both countries doing well in others, and Anthony Pratt's a recent example of that, and of course the most celebrated of all has been that well-known media figure Rupert Murdoch, who's made quite an imprint not only in his own country, Australia, but in the United States and elsewhere. So I can say that it was a natural expression of a deeply held relationship held very dear between the two countries. And we can thank those who made the contribution. I mentioned in particular Bob and Michael and my former Deputy Prime Minister, Mark Vaile, who was the Trade Minister at the time it was signed. I thank them for that because it has provided us with that anchorage and stability in a very volatile and challenging world. And it will go on doing that in the years ahead because it's not going to get any easier. And can I just conclude by saying that we celebrate that also against the background that China still remains our major export destination. And at a time when that relationship is extremely difficult and there's a level of aggression by the Chinese in the context of that relationship we haven't had before, that I hope all Australians remember just how critical the Chinese market is to Australia's economic future.
Well, thank you. And the evidence of the success of the agreement is not just in trade, but also in investment. And investment is now 3 times what it was 15 years ago, the two-way investment, with more than 1,000 Australian companies operating profitably over here in the United States. Bob Zoellick, you brought to the table not only your political skills and your economic skills, but also an astute awareness of the difficult politics here in the United States. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you had to go through in order to get the free trade agreement over the line with a Congress that actually wasn't unanimous in its support? There were Republicans and Democrats that voted against the free trade agreement with Australia.
Well, thanks, Joe, and thank you and Simon and Mark and the Studies Center for hosting this event, including, I understand, one of my former colleagues when I was at the Treasury, Kim Hoggard, who moved to Australia and serves on your board, I gather. And it's a special pleasure to be with Prime Minister Howard and Michael Thawley, who together with Mark Vaile really were the Australian architects of this free trade agreement. I also want to thank the ambassador, and it's a pleasure to be with my former colleague Wendy, who then took this idea a step further in the TPP, at least for everybody, but the United States. So I would like to, I'll address your question, Joe, but I'd like to make 3 brief points. First, a word of context. The United States' first free trade agreement was with Israel in '85, and then we had, as Prime Minister Howard mentioned, the NAFTA Accord in the Bush 41 administration, George H.W. Bush. And so the real first concrete proposal of Australia-US FTA was one actually that I put into a re-election document for President Bush 41 in 1992 when I was serving as Deputy Chief of Staff. So it was part of a campaign plan for the future. The initial reaction of the Keating government was, I'll say, cool, but we lost the election anyway. So I had the wonderful opportunity, which you don't often have in history, in 2001 of having a second chance. So I guess I would turn this around for your Australians and say, we were trying to court you for at least 10 years and you were just playing hard to get on this issue. But as we did so, I think it was also important to recognize we were trying to move forward the broader trade agenda. So this was partly bilateral, regional, and global aims. And over 15 years, some of those were fulfilled, others faded. But I think the point that I would stress is that I always viewed this free trade agreement as part of a process or a platform. on which to build. And I think that's still true today. Second point, the bilateral aim, as the Prime Minister said, was clearly to deepen and extend the network of economic ties. And of course, that begins with the trade barriers, but we really saw it as something much more. We saw it as trying to encourage the two-way investment and business links. And as the Prime Minister mentioned, the real strategic idea here was to try to connect Australia to US innovation. Yes, that's technology, but it goes beyond technology. The US economy, as the ambassador mentioned, is constantly adapting, whether it's ideas, its systems, its networks, its methods. And frankly, we thought for the long-term partnership, the closer we drew that connection, it would assist in business innovation in Australia. We'd seen with the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which was passed in '88 and then NAFTA in '93, that you'd had a real effect on the Canadian businesses. And as the ambassador said, frankly, if you can compete with US counterparts, you're going to be a global player. And then we also wanted to support more of the people-to-people ties. And I'm so delighted, as all of you have mentioned, that the Australians across the US economy and society, if anything, seem more present over the past. It was also the idea that for the future, it was important to have an economic partnership that was the foundation for security ties. And going to the practicality as a political matter, in particular, Michael Thawley and I, with Mark Vaile, we didn't want to miss this second chance. So we wanted to push very hard to get this agreement done and passed the US Congress by 2004. And what this, I think, important to emphasize is a lot of people have policy and ideas, but sense of timing and action is critical if you really want to try to get some things as done. And that led to some tactical decisions. One of the questions I saw from your audience was, why doesn't this have an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism? Well, frankly, it wasn't very popular in Australia, and it wasn't very popular with the US Congress. So it was the first time I decided to drop it. And when I got some complaints from US business, frankly, my answer was, if you can't trust Australian courts, there's not much I can do for you. Now, a more difficult problem, which the Prime Minister remembers, is that the sugar lobby in the United States is a terribly protectionist lobby. Because in the Senate, you got 2 senators, we got a lot of sugar states because of sugar beets as well as sugar cane. And I couldn't run the risk that those guys would hold this up. So I couldn't include any sugar, even though the Prime Minister made his best efforts for Queensland and others. We had some very sensitive topics that will actually be important for the future. And Michael and I spent a lot of time on the healthcare system, which is actually kind of relevant if you think about negotiations with the UK going to the future and the concerns about the National Health Service. This suggests that any area where you have domestic regulation starts to move beyond traditional trade barriers, becomes more of a challenge. And then we had the cultural issue where I really had to grind my teeth because it looked to me like Australian actors dominate Hollywood and now your mysteries are all over our channels. So we gave in on that one too, just to sort of help with the politics. The third point, of course, was that we tried to link this to the regional and global aims. And here the point was, the free trade agreement that we crafted was supposed to be a cutting-edge deal to match the changing international economy. So it was deep on services, intellectual property rights, e-commerce, express delivery, environment and labor, transparency, anti-corruption, investment. It went far beyond the WTO standards. And frankly, we hoped that based on the example that our 2 economies could set, that we could expand it. And that's exactly what Wendy and her Australian counterparts did with the TPP. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's with 12 economies. So for the US, it was with 11 others. 6 of those we already had free trade agreements with. So you added 5 new ones. And frankly, I think it is very doubtful you could have brought that agreement together if you didn't have the template and the experience that you'd had through these free trade agreements. So frankly, I think if the US had stayed with TPP, and I compliment that Australia did, you would have probably added Korea, which Wendy had negotiated with, and as well as others in ASEAN. And that would have given you some leverage with China, including with some of the Chinese economic reformers on issues like state-owned enterprises and competitive neutrality. Frankly, I also thought that the Australia-US free trade agreement and the type of TPP could help us with models with the WTO, which I'm sure is also interest to your audience. There's always been a problem with the WTO, which is that dispute settlement alone, unless you keep the rules coming forward, is going to probably grind to a halt. So whether it would be as pathfinders or plurilateral agreements, the WTO needs to keep trying to move ahead. And instead, the Doha round kind of faltered in 2008. I'm afraid the Obama administration was a little lethargic, and obviously the Trump administration is hostile. So a closing word back to this point about politics and international ties. We were, of course, negotiating with a liberal national government, but we tried very hard to get the support of the Labour Party leaders. And if you recall, at this era, the Prime Minister will recall, there were some transitions in the Labour Party leadership at this time. This was a difficult time for the Labour Party. And frankly, I was always very appreciated that some of the rising leaders in the Labour Party stood with this free trade agreement and put country over party and for the US-Australia arrangements. And in the US, as you mentioned, Joe, we had a similar advantage really because most members of Congress are very positive towards Australia. And at the end of the day, while we were going to have difficult issues, we knew if we could pitch this as voting for a country as opposed to a deal, that we were in good shape. And Ambassador Thawley has the best story of that because one of the most sensitive issues in today, of course, in US politics is immigration and visas. And he wanted to try to put something in the agreement about this, and I was warned off by the Congress. So he went around me and just negotiated separately with the Congress and did something that I couldn't do by working out a special visa arrangement for Australia. So I'd close with this point. Ultimately, foreign policy has to be rooted in domestic political support. And I want to thank the US Study Center for all the interest that you've had, whether it's security, economics, or free societies that look beyond the democratic politics in our countries over a given day. So I appreciate being with you.
Thank you so much, Bob. And what a generous introduction to Michael Thawley, who was the man on the ground negotiating it. My experience is Michael doesn't tend to listen to what he's asked to do and does what he wants to do. And he did so, thankfully, getting an E3 visa, which I'm on at the moment. And it's great that he's here. and Michael, you were hugely instrumental in helping to whip the numbers on both the floor of the House and the Senate, but it wasn't easy. Do you want to go through some of those experiences and why, and what worked and didn't work when trying to convince, people here that the politics is hard?
Okay, I'll start. Thank you, Joe. I'll start by saying that my commission from the Legislative Affairs part of the White House was 80 Democrat votes, and I think, Bob, we got there. I want to just say about Bob what a wonderful friend of Australia he's been over decades, and his knowledge of Australia is truly very impressive. I used to think that in negotiations with Bob that it was just so wonderful to watch him at work. The only problem was that he was at work on us. I would have liked to have seen him at work on someone else. He was a very, very tough negotiator, but also someone who kept the mission in mind the whole time. I think he's been a wonderful partner for us. I want to make an advertisement on the E3, Joe, if you don't mind. Like you, I'm here on an E3 visa. We're probably amongst the older, me in particular, holders of this visa. But for young Australians in particular, who want to get some experience in the United States at a professional or business level, there's no more wonderful opportunity than this visa. We're the only country in the world to have it. There's a quota each year which has never been filled, and the numbers can increase every year if people want. We're not limited to the numbers. It can grow in the sense that there's 5,000 10,500 each year, and they can accumulate. For someone who wants to match themselves and gain experience in the most competitive economy in the world, with some of the most brilliant people and most fast-growing businesses, there couldn't be a better opportunity. No other country has this arrangement. We're the only one with this special legislation. It means that if you're a young Australian and you are applying for a job, and your competition is, say, someone from France or someone from the UK or someone from Ireland, you're the only person who can say, I can be there in 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. So it's a wonderful, wonderful advantage. A couple of other things I wanted to pick up on. To me, the important thing about this agreement was, amongst the things that have already been mentioned, dealing with the trade problems which were kept on coming up. But the most important thing I felt was that we wanted to create a sense for Australia that the US was part of our economic space. That was a place that we could operate in. We had a right to operate in it, and we'd be welcome. And so it's a sense of expanding our vision as to where our businesses could operate. And then, of course, as Bob mentioned, in particular, it's investment and technology, which actually are the spurs to economic integration and to growth. And what better thing could happen for Australia than to have a closer tie with the United States? One final point that I want to mention that I don't think anyone has commented on so far, and that is, I felt when I arrived that Australia was lacking a constituency, a political constituency in the US. I was very struck, as others have been, and you mentioned this yourself, by the amount of Australian investment in the US, and also the presence of Australians in US business. When I arrived, the CEOs of Ford, News Corp, Westfield, Philip Morris, Visy, the head of the World Bank were all Australians. And not that long ago, the CEO of Kellogg's, J&J, and very senior people in IBM. And so we had a presence which was, I think, would have surprised most Australians. But what we didn't have was the sort of political constituency, say, that Israel has, or even Portugal, funnily enough. And it was partly because we hadn't understood just how far-reaching geographically and in terms of its penetration in the economy, our presence in the US market was. And this I saw as a way of creating a political constituency for us. And I think that's very important, because at the end of the day, you don't get anything in a democratic country without really strong political support. And I think the FTA's helped consolidate that. It's given us a foundation on which we can engage with the business community, with state and local leaders, and with the senators and congressmen. And so I think it's been valuable in a very important and political way to us.
Well, thank you, Michael. And interestingly, the E3 is excluded from President Trump's restrictions on new visas. So you can have a full working visa here, but not be able to get into the United States. But if you've got an E3, you can get in at the moment. So well done on that. We are going to talk about the future in a moment with Wendy Cutler, but I just wanted to go back to the issue of bipartisanship. And Prime Minister Howard said at the 10-year mark that it was hugely important to have an element of bipartisanship in order to get these things through. And that was reflected in both the US Congress and in the Australian Parliament. There's no doubt that Stephen Conroy was pretty instrumental in helping to get a quite divided Labor Party over the line. I think he's on at the moment. There he is, the handsome Stephen Conroy.
Great to be with you, Joe, and good to see Bob and Michael and the former Prime Minister Howard, who were recently in Israel together. The Labor Party at the time, I'm sure you'll remember, had a leader called Mark Latham, who was fundamentally opposed to the agreement. And that gave it unique challenges to try and get it through. But as all of you will know, we had a magnificent supporter of the US in Kim Beazley in the Parliament with us. We had Wayne Swan, Steve Smith, and a host of others who all knuckled down to make sure that the caucus was ultimately willing to support the agreement. And I always remember there's an 11 o'clock at night message from Mark Latham, because that was his way of dealing with people he didn't like. He'd just leave you a message late at night saying, sorry, Steve, read the report, going to be opposing the free trade agreement. So I sent him a message back saying that's going to be a problem because I'm going to be publicly supporting it in the Senate report that comes out in 2 days' time. And then an emergency meeting was held. Kim Beazley got to his office before I did. Swanee, Smith, myself, we went to full court press, and we eventually, with a couple of amendments, one minor, one a bit more major, which I have to tell this as a funny story because Prime Minister Howard's on the line. We held a press conference at about 1:15 before question time, and Mark Latham outlined Labor's position on patents and the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. And I understand the Prime Minister had all the country's top experts on patents in there to watch to see what Labor was going to say. And Latham, of course, completely stuffed up his explanation of what our position was. And I've heard the story that the Prime Minister and the patent experts sitting there scratching their head going, what does that mean? We have no idea what that meant. And we went straight into question time and asked, will John Howard and the Liberal Party support Labor's amendments on the PBS? And of course, they had no idea what they meant because Latham had completely stuffed up the explanation. So he couldn't say yes. So for about 2 weeks, we had this farcical situation where Latham was advocating something that he didn't understand. And I was trying to make sure that everybody understood that it was this, which was in the press release that I had put out with Mark Latham, and that's what they should focus on, not Mark Latham's absurd misexplanation. And ultimately, when the dust settled, the Prime Minister understood that the amendment was nothing like Mark Latham had described, and we were able to reach an agreement to support that amendment. And Labor came on board because the Prime Minister showed exactly why he'd been Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister, by being smarter than Mark Latham.
Thanks, Stephen, and that's, your support was instrumental. The irony being, of the 20 years I was in Parliament, for all of the free trade agreements, the US free trade agreement was probably the most contentious. And in the Abbott government, we negotiated free trade agreements with Korea, Japan, and China, and they had a less contentious package through the Parliament than the US free trade agreement. So it does illustrate that sometimes it's better to have the fight early over issues like free trade and protectionism and get it out of the way and then start progressing along the line. We have before we come to Wendy and talk about the future, we have AB Culverhouse to give us a message from the President of the United States.